Welcome to the WorldDAB session on the NABA UX Guidelines. In this session we have David Leyer from NABA and Lawrence Harrison, who's the chairman of the WorldDAB UX group. Over to you, David, first.
Rosie, hi, and hi, Lawrence. Let me just introduce myself again. I'm David Leyer. I'm the Vice President, Advanced Engineering with the National Association of Broadcasters. Today I'm here in my role as Vice Chair of the NABA Radio Committee, where we're going to be talking about this exciting project that we're doing with WorldDAB. So Lawrence, hi, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My day job is with the broadcaster-backed non-profit organisation Radio Player as Director of their Automotive Partnerships, but I have the pleasure of chairing the WorldDAB User Experience Group. That group is a collaboration between car manufacturers, broadcasters, and automotive technology suppliers. We started just over 3 years ago with a clear aim to try and improve the in-car digital radio experience. I think very early on, we realised that we needed to do some consumer research to find out what the experience was today. We conducted that research, which I'll talk about later, and produced the first user experience guidelines in 2018. It's a living document. We're now on version 2, and we're absolutely delighted that NABA and David have initiated this project to develop a North American version. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Let me just try and advance my slide here. Sorry about that. So let me say a word about NABA. We're the North American Broadcaster Association. We're not-for-profit organization. We're based in Toronto in Canada. Our members are broadcasters and technology providers throughout North America. We have a number of committees. The work on the in-car user experience project is being done in the radio committee, which again I mentioned earlier I'm currently vice chair of. We've been following the work of WorldDAB regarding the user experience guideline, and last year it occurred to us that we needed to try and develop a North American version of something like this. It's such a great and useful document. And we reached out to Lawrence and Rosie, and we started collaborating on it last year. And so before I say more about the NABA project, Lawrence, maybe you could just say a word or two about how you got to the point where you are.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned before that when we set up the group, we started to talk about the user experience of digital radio in car. And although everybody had different opinions from both car manufacturers and broadcasters, we quickly realized that there was no consumer research out there, nothing that told us what consumers thought about this. So we conducted some across 5 European markets. It was incredibly useful. It gave us some very clear pointers as to where some of the problems were in the user experience. And it helped us to define 7 clear use cases, consumer use cases, ranging from I want to find my radio in the car, I want to find my DAB stations easily, through to I want to know more about what I'm listening to. And then for each of those consumer use cases, we debated and discussed and defined a very clear user experience guideline. And I think to date, these have been incredibly effective and incredibly useful based on the feedback we've had.
And this, of course, is the launch point for our NABA project. We are looking at each use case and asking ourselves, how would we modify this use case to be more applicable to the North American market? And here's my first example showing the first use case. Obviously, we're going to want to say HD radio in a North American document, not DAB. That's a pretty obvious change. Something a little less obvious, perhaps, is that for hybrid radio in particular, which platform signal is being selected by the receiver is something that North American broadcasters are perhaps more concerned about than other broadcasters, because we have additional fees that what U.S. broadcasters in particular are charged when a signal is received by streaming audio instead of over the air. So as a result, U.S. broadcasters are more interested, I think, in and having some input as to when the receiver is going to be using the streaming version of the signal. And this is one of the things that we would like to try and address in the North American version of the user guideline. And this is something that we're currently working on. Here's another example for the second use case. Again, there's the obvious deletion of DAB and the insertion of HD radio where appropriate. The DAB radios typically do a station guide from A to Z. In North America, we would typically do it by frequency. So this is another example of where we would need to make a change to the guideline for use in North America. Similarly, we would like to see some emphasis on AM radio, because AM radio is something that is still widely used in North America. Finally here, this is an example of a use case where doesn't currently exist, but again, focusing on AM, what we have noticed is that as all electric vehicles are introduced, some of them aren't including AM, and this is something that US and North American broadcasters want to highlight in a guideline to automakers that this is something that's still important. It's something that listeners are interested in. It's something that broadcasters are supporting. So this is just in a very short description of what it is we're doing. I'm looking forward to working with WorldDAB throughout the year and with the folks at NABA to finalize this document. Once we have a good draft, we'll be circulating it within the administrations represented in NABA, which are Canada, US, and Mexico. We'll see, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a release. Maybe I'll turn it back over to you, Lawrence.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's worth saying a few things on future activities. Firstly, to reiterate, this collaboration with David and the team at NABA is important. We know that car manufacturers need to focus on a global market wherever they can. So extending and amplifying the message of the user experience guidelines in the North American market is particularly important. And we're already learning some lessons from the analysis that David and the team have done of our existing document, and we'll be updating that and making some changes later this year. And we've also developed a set of future user experience guidelines, which we'll be focusing on, which touch on areas like enhanced visuals, on-demand and podcasts, and a more personalized experience. But it's a great piece of work.
Rosie, I think that's it for me. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak to your audience, and we'll again look forward to working with both of you as the year progresses.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you both. For more information on the UX guidelines for WorldDAB and in the future when NABA release their guidelines, please go to the WorldDAB website where you can find out what you need.